there's obviously a clear disparity between the two agencies, and it really is a function of how each agency weights. It appears that it's a function of how each rating agency weights different metrics. So for Moody's, they highlight a trifecta of issues. One is policy, debt, and energy. On the policy front, the concern that Moody's has primarily is that the government seems unable to properly measure policies that it enacts. Essentially, they have to enact something and then wait for the outcome, as opposed to being able to predict what the outcome could possibly be. And what drives that? That's driven by an absence of data. So we've known for several years that our CSO has been effectively non-functional. Now the government has been taking steps to remedy that. But at this stage, it isn't remedied. So the information that the government needs to make a decision is not readily available. Or it's not in a form that can allow them to manipulate it to make decisions. So that, from Moody's perspective, if the government says, I'm going to do X, Moody's is saying, well, we don't want to wait until the conclusion of the fiscal to understand what X is. You need to tell us with some degree of certainty what the outcome could look like. So there's that gap. Then both Moody's and S&P agree that our debt metrics are much higher than where we should be relative to the peers at the previous level. So at the A- level, you can't have debt to GDP close to 60%. Your peer group is within that. Similar for Moody's. So we expect, and they project debt to get to 70%. So for Moody's, they're bringing us below the investment grade level. So they're consistent on the debt from a perspective that it creates a headwind to the rating and lowers it. And then we're all familiar with what has happened in the energy sector, and both agencies are consistent on that score. Where I suppose S&P gives us credit more so than Moody's is they look at our net creditor position. And by that they mean how much money does Trinidad have as a country, how much money is owed to it with respect to what is placed in bank accounts both here and abroad, and what is invested relative to what we owe, so what we've borrowed. And on that metric, Trinidad is a net creditor in that we are owed more money relative to what we owe. And S&P gives that a significant weighting relative to Moody's. Moody's references it in its rating, but it appears it's not as significant a comfort for them as it is for S&P. And I think those are the key reasons why there's a disparity between the two.
Looking at that trifecta between policy, debt, energy, where does Fitch come in to the point that the finance minister is saying it may be a feasible thing to actually get rated from them?
Well, that's an interesting perspective. At the end of the day, ratings, having three ratings, one would have to question how additive that would be. Fitch is one of the, just like in the accounting world, you have Deloitte, you have PwC, you have Ernst & Young. Fitch, S&P, and Moody's are the big three. So you have two of the big three. The third is possibly not going to be additive, and could come with a different perspective and a different view. I'm not familiar with what their methodology is. The fact that we haven't used them before suggests that there's comfort with the two that we have today. And to the extent that one is not giving you the rating that you would like, doesn't necessarily mean you should switch, but sort of understand the perspective and what corrective action could we take to return our ratings to the investment grade level that we would all welcome.
And what are some of those corrective actions?
Well, both Moody's and S&P are consistent on a policy. We have to develop the ability to implement efficient and effective policy. And we have to develop the ability to measure the effectiveness of the policy. That measurement comes again from data. We have a paucity of data, and we have to fix that problem. Once that is corrected, then we can better understand holistically what is happening in the economy and how we adjust, and what levers are available to us, and what results what results we will get from pulling those levers. Today we don't have that. We don't have that capability. There's a rigidity in our expenditure. Government needs to manage and rationalize expenditure across the board. Both Moody's and S&P point to the significant transfers and subsidies that we have. The reality is we continue to be, relatively speaking, a developing state, so some of those things are very sticky. So how do you cut healthcare? How do you cut education? The public service is always the whipping boy, but at the end of the day, they are people too, and they deserve their salaries. And we have to understand how we rationalize and create efficiencies in those areas. So a mixture of policy, reform, data, and managing the debt. The debt has started to creep, and we need to figure out a way to get us to remain within the 60% zone, 60 to 65% zone, which could be achieved by the government implementing fiscal rules. Some of our counterparts in the Caribbean have done that, and fiscal rules essentially codify how much you can spend relative to how much you can earn, and it's legislated and you remain within that legislated band for a period of at least 3 years for it to qualify as a fiscal rule. So you set yourself up to say, I will only spend X relative to Y for the next 3 years, and that is in legislation. Now there will be situations where you could breach that, but they will be documented. So really for emergency situations. So in case of natural disasters or financial crisis in the financial sector, two examples of where you would bend your fiscal rules.
Have you seen examples possibly in the region where governments have walked that middle road of taking financial measures and taking those measures in hand in addition to looking at the social aspects? And I ask that because a little while ago there was a report coming out of the IMF that many of its structural adjustment policies may not have been the most ideal, looking at the results that are happening after.
Right. So I think there are two examples in the Caribbean. There's Jamaica and Grenada. Grenada took somewhat of a unique approach with the IMF in that they developed what they called a homegrown structural adjustment program. So their program was designed primarily to cater for that social fallout, because Grenada is a much more vulnerable economy than we are. Much smaller population, much smaller landmass, not diversified to any extent. They also implemented fiscal rules, and they are the only country in the Eastern Caribbean that has implemented fiscal rules. So they've by going with the homegrown solution, they've tried to balance the social impact of the changes that they've had to make, but the government has, in balancing the social impact, has become more responsible in how it spends money relative to what it earns. So I think that, in my view, solidifies the social contract. I am becoming more responsible in how I spend, and I'm also asking you to tighten your belt. So there's a combination. When we look at Jamaica, Jamaica is a case in point of being forced almost to have to adopt the fiscal rule. Not that Grenada wasn't, but they did it in a different way. In 2013, I believe, Jamaica went to the IMF for relief. 2010 initially, and that program failed. And Jamaica went back to the IMF in 2013, and the IMF was very prescriptive as to what you had to do to get relief from the IMF. One of which was implementing fiscal rules, and the Jamaican government agreed to implement those rules in August of 2013, and by March of 2014, legislation was enacted. The social fallout in Jamaica hasn't been as difficult as you would expect under an IMF program, and the country has progressed. Again, I think it's a matter of signaling. The government has signaled with its approach of more discipline that they are taking a different view, and as opposed to simply cutting programs, they're becoming more responsible. So I think if that signal is sent to the public, the hardships, because there are hardships that will invariably come with adjustment, will be easier to manage.
You talk about that and you make me think of how do we trim the fat hair in some of the expenditures that we have.
Yes. Well, at the Chairman, we are part of the Joint Chambers Initiative. We are very big on the operationalization of procurement legislation. That would really do, in our view, and when I say our, not only the AMCHAMs, but the other chambers that are part of this effort, that would be a significant step in ensuring that there's value for the money we spend, and there is oversight for the money that we spend. And with those things in place, some of the wastage that we all believe happens should be reduced. And then that should help in us coming back into what should be normalized expenditure patterns.
Moving forward, what are some of the first things you think we need to start trying to implement or dealing with? Because you've given us a broad context.
Right.
So in terms of getting data to move forward, to help guide policy, to deal with monitoring, or actually just taking, okay, these are some of the things we're going to do even before we have that data. Right.
Well, we still have the CL financial issue hanging over us, and the billions of dollars that the conglomerate owes to the country. That is something that the government has to be a priority, because that would, if the government sticks to its commitment to the agencies that it made when we first entered in this arrangement, which was that any debt that was raised would be repaid via asset sales. That would put us in a good place. Now, that is difficult to achieve in today's context because we made that commitment when oil was obviously at $80 a barrel and gas prices were much, much higher. But that is a number one priority. There are really no short-term fixes that the government can implement today to fix the issue. What they're doing now in the short term is utilizing what they call the fiscal buffers. So the sale of FCB shares, the potential sale of TTNGL shares, and the dividends from NGC. Those are the really only short-term measures that the government can implement that will bring an immediate relief to some degree, while we, as S&P sort of intimates, while we await a recovery in A, commodity prices, and B, our production. But what I've articulated before are more medium to long-term solutions. So to the extent that energy prices remain subdued, and to the extent that our production remains where it is today, the pain is going to persist for some time. And these buffers will take us only so far. So the work of ensuring that the medium to long term happens has to start today. So the right sizing of the CSO, or the ensuring that we have the data, that is ongoing, and that has to be brought forward rapidly. We have to then start looking at public sector reform. How do we make the public sector a more efficient delivery system and really live to its name, public service? How does it best enable and serve the public to do what needs to be done? And from a medium to long-term basis, government now has to start looking at itself as a facilitator. So what framework does government have to create for the public and for business to move the economy forward?
We're listening to the fact that we've gotten these ratings from these two agencies. Mm-hmm. There's been a downgrade. So that is one thing in being as citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. What does it mean to people outside looking and seeing these two ratings? How do they treat with us? Well,
ultimately, the ratings are directed at effectively an investor class, right? People who either want to buy government debt or debt issued by state enterprises, or who want to invest in Trinidad and Tobago. Investment grade ratings, part of their function is to demonstrate a certain level of stability within a country. And any investor that's coming into a country needs to have stability because they're going to put capital to work. So when the ratings slip, the investors could get wary. They could say, look, is that a sign of instability, and do I want to put my money to work there? That's one class of investor. Another class of investor could say, look, ratings have slipped, so maybe now is a good time to enter because I may be able to get more out of the government than I would have ordinarily obtained had they been an investment grade. So the government has to understand how it balances that, because there are ones that are going to be shy because they fear the instability, and that is a subset. And then there's going to be the subset that sees opportunity and may think they can negotiate more firmly with the state to get what they want. And that's where the government has to be very careful to balance what an investor who may have an aggressive posture towards the country, how you balance that need with what you have to provide the country.
In terms of getting statements from AMCHAM, looking at what it is, AMCHAM is thinking about the current economic climate, how do people source those publications?
Well, like this, we come to these talk shows. You can visit our website, and much of what we discuss is there. We put publications and news releases out, and the government reaches out to us every year for budget submissions, and we're actually working on that submission today because we just received that request. So that submission is available for all. Once it's will be made available, and we will have a post-budget event where people can come and listen to what our views are and the views of our membership.